It was a crude age, violent, rebellious, disorderly, but slowly it was trained to order, to discipline and self-discipline and reason, all in the interests of the crown, which became the center of the state, or even the state itself. The age of absolutism, this time on the Western tradition. The 17th century in Europe was the age of absolutism, the doctrine and practice of centralized authority and absolute sovereign power represented by the king. Political absolutism was nothing new, of course, but the modern model was a reaction to the disorder of the declining feudal state and the divisions of religious conflict. It was thought that order, peace, tranquility, prosperity could best be ensured by a central authority against whose will neither the church, nor feudal lords, nor local traditions could prevail. The simplest argument for monarchic absolutism was that kings derived their authority from God. Now, in this version, the divine right of kings to rule permitted them to control not only their subjects, but also the church. And so the medieval conflict between secular and spiritual powers was pretty much settled in the 17th century in favor of the secular power, even in Catholic countries. But there were more pragmatic arguments for absolutism, which were all about what today we would call law and order. If you wanted law and order, you had to obey a single will, like that of Louis XIV. If you didn't do that, you were condemned to chaos. Civil war, foreign war, religious war, social war. The theme of civil peace dominated the political thought of the 17th century, and most people looked to the monarch to keep the peace. And you can see why this was so important from the example of France. France had a strong, efficient king in Henry IV, but he was murdered in 1610. This left the country in the hands of his widow, Marie de Medicis, who acted as regent for the 9-year-old heir, Louis XIII. Marie was fat and foolish, although she got Rubens to paint her as plump and grand, and the result of her regency was a period in which the country went to the dogs and the power of the crown was threatened. When Louis XIII grew up, he found as his first minister a man of iron and genius, Cardinal Richelieu. With Richelieu at the helm, the nobles were gradually humbled, order was restored, the French Protestants, the Huguenots who had been acting up, were put in their place, and the prestige of the crown was greater than ever before. You can see this quite well in Alexandre Dumas' novel The Three Musketeers, which is about 4 noble gentlemen in a royal guards regiment, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan. All of them were likely to pull out their swords and start fighting at the slightest provocation, and even without provocation. The villain of the story is Cardinal Richelieu because he is a man of order. He doesn't appreciate all this mayhem, and he punishes breaches of the peace. Now, if we look at this in context, we find that although Louis XIII and Richelieu appreciated a fine swordsman, they felt they had to repress dueling just as they had to repress private warfare and castle raiding. So in the novel, they lightly punish D'Artagnan for fighting in public, and in real life, they cut off the head of a royal duke for disobeying royal edicts against fighting. On the other hand, They encouraged hunting as an outlet for excess energy. They wanted the nobles to amuse themselves without burning villages and without killing other nobles who could be useful serving in the king's armies. Eventually, royal policies and socio-economic forces would turn the noble from a dinosaur into a peacock, but not at once. In the 1640s, after both Louis and Richelieu died, there was another young heir, Louis XIV, who wasn't even 5 years old, and another regent, his mother, Anne of Austria, and another cardinal minister, Cardinal Mazarin. And there was another series of civil wars called the Frondes, in which the nobles and the great court of law, the Parliament of Paris, tried again to assert their rights against the encroaching power of the crown. That was the last desperate struggle of the nobility to save itself from subordination and decay. They were specialized fighting animals, and the New Age had no more use for them. The New Age wanted producers, businessmen, lawyers, administrators, and bureaucrats. It wanted soldiers too, of course. And the real-life model of D'Artagnan was going to end his career as commander of the King's Musketeers. But it wanted disciplined soldiers, not Rambo types. So the nobles were doomed as rivals to the crown, although they put up a desperate fight. Louis XIV was never going to forget the Frondes. The rioting in Paris got so bad that on one occasion the 10-year-old king and his mother had to be smuggled out of the city, and they spent the night on little bales of straw because there was no other bedding. And Louis never trusted Paris again. He never trusted the nobles either. He found a lot of his ministers among the middle classes. He avoided Paris, where he risked being trapped and intimidated. He kept the nobles in their place, which was on a kind of golden leash, splendid, idle, and useless. Louis didn't want to destroy the nobles. He only wanted to domesticate them and cut their claws. Once this was done, the nobility was going to be preserved, a lapdog aristocracy, incapable of hurting the king anymore, but providing an impressive facade for the absolute state, an impressive court for the absolute king, and an edifying upper crust for the new stability through hierarchy program on which the king based his order and his power. The nobility revolved around the king as the planets revolve around the sun, which incidentally is not why Louis is known as the Sun King. That is because his eulogists compared him to Apollo, the sun god. But if he was himself the shining sun, until his death in 1715, Louis above all was the center of the state. Indeed, he was the state. Hence the famous assertion, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, which probably was more like "L'État est à moi," meaning the state is mine. And just because it had taken a lot of hard work and hard fighting to get to this point, the king and the whole apparatus of royal propaganda insisted on hierarchy, order, social discipline, and codes of behavior, which you can see reflected in the art, architecture, and literature of the period, as well as in its manners and politics. The epitome of this can be found at Versailles. On the one hand, riches and luxury, a grandiose facade. and a no less grandiose interior. On the other hand, great discipline in the use and arrangement of these riches. The great halls and corridors of Versailles are not at all like the homey hodgepodge of Queen Victoria's drawing rooms. They are more in a style that today we would describe as Prussian. There's something rigid about their grandeur. You can also see it in the gardens of this pretty chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte. The builders laid out a vista, they laid out the gardens, they even laid out a forest to surround a canal, all inspired by Versailles, as 100 places from Portugal to Poland were inspired. But the forest has no underbrush. The trees stand in straight rows planted like Indian corn. But this concern for order was itself the reflection of and the reaction against a very disordered time. Remember that the court moved to Versailles from Paris because the king wanted to put some distance between himself and his unruly subjects. And this distance was not only one of space, but also a symbolic distance of quality, a concrete demonstration of grandeur so impressive as to make him unapproachable. Greatness is only really great if it has about it a quality of the unbelievable, of the marvelous in the exact sense of that word, arousing wonder, causing astonishment. The king doesn't want to be feared. He wants to be admired. And he wants people to be moved by the spectacle of him in his glory to the point of worshipping him. The monarchy and its new order had to establish itself on a myth, but the myth itself had to be based on a sort of fact, on the concrete impression that would make people accept it. And this is where Versailles came in, and where the art of the time came in, as vehicles of new values and new illusions on which the new order could be based. The previous generation of French art in the early 17th century had been diverse and lively. Take the work of Jacques Callot, the master etcher who left us an unrivaled record of the horrors of the 30 Years' War. Or that of Philippe de Champagne, cold but full of restrained passion. Or the Lenain brothers' strong, realistic pictures of peasants. The Lenains were so completely pushed aside that no one remembered them until the 19th century. Or consider the work of Georges de La Tour, austere but rich and dramatic. La Tour was only rediscovered in 1915. What the king wanted instead was a rigorous, reasonable, cool style. And the ideal was to be found in the paintings of Nicolas Poussin, much admired for their purity. Or else look at Rigaud's painting of Louis himself. They're grand, all right, but I find them rather stiff and rigid. You can also see the same grand design in architecture. Look at the east front of the Louvre, or at the churches built by Louis's favorite architect, Nicolas Mansart. Now, compare them with the works of Bernini in Rome. Roman splendor has fantasy and warmth. French splendor is fashioned by bureaucrats. It's not really human. You can say with Kenneth Clark that it reflects the triumph of the authoritarian state. It also reflects the logical solutions that Louis's finance minister, Colbert, the greatest administrator of the 17th century, was trying to impose on every part of public life, and especially on the arts. But we can also find the counterpart of this spirit in the work of Pierre Corneille, a writer whose life from 1605 to 1684 covered most of the period. Corneille's tragedies, these are first editions, suggest how difficult it must have been to harness the violent, disordered passions that threatened the new order, and they also suggest the way in which the harnessing was brought about. The crucial term in all this is the word passions. Passions which could threaten institutions like the family or the state, which could harm or hamper great interests, which could spoil important political plans, and which had to be subordinated again and again to a superior duty. If you think that in the world of the Three Musketeers, a silly young blade can start a riot just because of a foolish argument, or could enter conspiracies with a foreign enemy just for the sake of a pair of pretty eyes, you can see how important it was to discipline or to downgrade certain kinds of pride or gallantry which were merely thoughtless satisfactions of the self at the expense of society. And this problem, which was the problem of Richelieu and of Mazarin, was also in slight disguise the essential problem of the tragedies of Corneille. The best known of these tragedies is The Cid, where love has to be subordinated to honor and duty even at the cost of two lovers' happiness. Don Rodrigue is a hero of the Spanish wars against the Moors, and it is the Moors who gave him the nickname of Cid, from El Cid, the leader. Rodrigue loves Ximene, and the two are about to marry when they are caught in a stupid quarrel between their two fathers. Rodrigue is forced to kill Ximene's father in a duel, and after that family honor forces Ximene to demand the death of the man she loves, and she does this. In the end, however, Rodrigue is not put to death for very pragmatic reasons, because the king wants him to fight the Moors. The Cid is basically an adventure story, a glorified Western. But on top of this Western, Corneille has built an epic of honor and love. Rodrigue is caught between his father and Ximene, his lady love. Ximene is torn between a legitimate and beautiful love for Rodrigue and the superior passion of honor and vengeance against Rodrigue, the man who killed her father. Although Rodrigue and Ximene love one another, honor and duty are stronger than passion, or rather the passion for honor is stronger than the passion that we call love. If you fail to sympathize with a dilemma, that just shows how different the 20th century is from the 17th. But remember that Corneille's plays were directed to an aristocracy that couldn't be touched by sermons, by moralizing, by sentimentalism. So he touched them by showing the greatness of self-discipline and self-denial, of not doing what you want, but what you should do. And note that Corneille didn't say, as a Christian would, that doing your duty makes you good. He said that doing your duty makes you great. When Corneille presented the struggle between passion and duty, it wasn't a new invention. What was new in Corneille was that he showed one legitimate passion opposed to another passion that was equally legitimate. It was important to elevate the debate from a contest between right and wrong to a contest between two rights. because a gentleman who got into a fight could not admit that he was wrong. But if you started by stipulating that his motives were honorable, he would at least stop to consider your argument, which is what Corneille achieved by raising the debate to a higher plane. And the 17th century people who loved his adventure stories felt vaguely that they were getting in them something they hadn't quite known before. And they were right. They hadn't known it before for the simple reason that it had gone out with the Greeks. Roman thought was too legalistic. Christian thought was too simplistic to tolerate the idea that there could be two rights, that there could be two sides to a conflict. This is a very sophisticated view, and it's fit only for very sophisticated minds. And the tiny minority of the 17th century society that read Corneille, that saw Corneille's plays, was hardly very sophisticated, but it was beginning to try at least. Where Greek tragedy laments the impotence of man in the face of destiny, Corneille's tragedy exalts the freedom to decide. Men and women can exert their will and rise superior to their destinies. Human will had been exalted by the Renaissance, but it was often will to power, to self-assertion. Corneille respects the will only when it acts in a good cause, when it is generous and great-hearted. And since duty, generosity, greatness of heart are very difficult, difficulty itself becomes the sign of duty, the very essence of duty. So that when the characters of Corneille see something difficult, they immediately decide that it is their duty to do it. Perhaps it was necessary in this violent and passionate age to propose an ideal of gratuitous self-discipline. Perhaps only passion could triumph over passion, the low or selfish passions mastered by bringing in another, the passion of pride. But these characters were not only proud, they were increasingly rational, and that is far more important. 17th century tragedy is the rationalistic tragedy par excellence, and reason complements pride as an instrument of mastery over the passions. Corneille presents love as one more passion subject to reason. The lovers that you find in Corneille's plays make the same kind of declarations as every other lover does. But then they explain very coolly and logically just why it's necessary for the loved one to be loved, why the lover must die if he doesn't get what he wants. In other words, they establish an identity between love and reason. They argue that they love whom they love as they love because it is the only reasonable thing to do. And if this is so, then love is no longer a passion. It is subject to all the rules and rationalizations of our minds. It can become an element of order rather than a factor of disorder. To come full circle then, we can see that the parallel of Cornelian tragedy with its reasoning approach to greatness or to love lay in the classical architecture of Versailles. Versailles had the same tension towards the heights, the same taste for order, the same subordination of the baser passion to the higher ones, including the discomfort of Versailles and its complete lack of any lavatories. And it had the same theatrical quality. And after mid-17th century, Versailles was going to become a symbol of all this kind of grand order, providing the center and the model and the inspiration of all Europe, as we shall see in our next program. Versailles was the authoritarian ideal, splendid yet regimented. But there were also those who looked beyond the rules of absolutism to the rules of nature and the rights of man. Absolutism and the social contract, this time on the Western tradition. Around 1700, Europe lives between two poles of attraction, England and France. Two kinds of culture, two models of what society and government should be like, more or less autocratic, more or less disciplined, more or less orderly. And the two contrasting systems compete at every level, for world power, of course, but also for cultural dominion. It was the tug of war between French barracks and English counting house, between informal English gardens and formal French parks, between hunger riots in France and political riots in England. And to start with, the contest seems one-sided because through most of the 18th century, French cultural dominance seems to match French political preponderance. And as with Corneille, the influence of Versailles had seeped into the habits of polite society. First, it was fashions in clothes, in food and entertainment. Then it was fashions in behavior. The rulers of Russia and Poland and Germany kept correspondence to tell them what the latest rules of etiquette were at the French court. Just because Versailles was so splendid did not mean, however, that it was also gay. It was regimented, monotonous, uncomfortable. Everyone and everything had their assigned part to play in the perfectly ordered, perfectly regulated whole. The anarchic individualism of an earlier time was banished. In art, as in court ritual, individual works of art lost their individuality. They became parts of a great monumental decoration. Versailles was in effect an authoritarian ideal, with its discipline, its tight, impressive structure, its censorship, its limitations. Outside this artificial structure, you were not supposed to explore, because exploration and experimentation outside set limits might produce change. And the great object of classical France in the 17th century was to avoid change, because change could unbalance the existing state of affairs. All the curiosities of the human mind had to be guarded against. They were not only dangerous, they were also foolish. Pascal, who was probably the greatest mind of 17th century France, Pascal declared that all the troubles of men came from the fact that they wouldn't stay quietly at home in their own room and make the most of what they had. Of course, Pascal was talking about faith and the privacy in which you could best come to terms with your own spirituality and with God. Even so, this was the thinking of men who had a room of their own to stay in. It was the point of view of satisfied men in a satisfied society whose supreme concern was to preserve stability and the status quo. And this was the essence of the classical spirit. It loved stability. It was the calm after the storm of the Renaissance and the Reformation, after those great tidal waves of movement and questioning and adventure. Now was the time for rest and meditation. Time to stop criticizing, time to stop wanting a change. And so politics, religion, society, and art were withdrawn from all the discussions of the past 2 centuries. The ship of humanity had come to port at last, and all wise men wished that it would stay there forever. Everything had fallen into place. Everything was perfect and perfectly ordered. Why should men risk experiments? Why should they risk speculations which might unsettle everything once more? Of course, you can't keep the world from turning. One man's perfection is another man's anachronism. And so absolutism carried the seeds of its own dissolution. It reflected the triumph of secular values over spiritual ones, the triumph of modern government over feudalism, and that didn't just mean the triumph of the crown, but the triumph of the counting house as well, which was going to bring change whether the crown liked it or not, and which was going to weigh the balance from the French model back to the English model. Absolute government was supposed to make not only strong nations, but also wealthy nations. 17th century economic doctrine said that it would achieve this by government regulation of the national economy to augment the power of the state at the expense of its rivals. This is the doctrine we call mercantilism. In mercantilism, a country's wealth lies in its stock of gold and silver. You have to gather in all the gold and silver you can, and you have to develop national industry so that your country can sell as much as possible abroad and buy as little as possible from abroad. That way, bullion flows in, not out, and the country is supposed to be stronger. National industries, however, have to be protected against foreign competition, so mercantilism is both nationalist and protectionist. In the Netherlands, trading companies like the East India Company had been created by free enterprise. But in France and Italy and Central Europe, it would be the state which founded ports like Brest, which encouraged trading companies and merchantmen to pursue what Colbert called a peaceful war. At first, businessmen were going to welcome this, but as they grew stronger, they began to change their minds. Commercial capital doesn't mind state investment, but it doesn't want state control, and the mercantilist state classically tells business what to do, as Louis XIV tells the French Council of Business here. In due course, however, business wanted a say in how the state was run. At the same time, business values began to affect the way people thought about law and society. In this view, law was a practical matter separate from religion, while politics had nothing to do with theology. These practical gentlemen are Dutch magistrates as painted by Rembrandt. The 17th century didn't find the rules of human society in some divine revelation. It studied nature and it studied man. Man has will, he can affect his destiny, he doesn't necessarily have to obey the will of others. He may seek his own satisfaction and happiness, which implies the rights of man. Furthermore, he's endowed with certain faculties, which means that he is supposed to use these faculties. And nature has made him gregarious and sociable. He wants to live in society, which means he has a social consciousness. It means that he's capable of social responsibility. This is the vital unwritten rule that nature has engraved on the heart of man. Or so argued a Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius, who would provide the basis of international law as we think of it today. This idea of society being the outcome of natural tendencies was going to be carried still further. The reasoning went this way. Men have a natural inclination to live in orderly and peaceful societies. Law grows out of their social instinct. They come together and they make a deal, a contract. They agree to defend property against trespass. They agree to submit to a common authority. And so we imagine that society begins with a contract between men, and then a second contract between men and someone to rule over them and protect them. And that is the social contract. In 17th century Europe, people wanted a strong power that would defend order and peace and force commercial expansion. And so they favored, or at least they accepted, absolute monarchy. But if they should decide that order and peace and trade would do better under some other regime, then they were likely to change their minds, which is exactly what happened in England, where the historic political revolutions of the 17th century took place, and where the political theories were worked out to justify them. In England, as you recall, Queen Elizabeth had confirmed the Protestant settlement of her father Henry VIII. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, she was succeeded by her nearest Protestant relative, the King of Scotland, James VI, who came to rule in England as James I. The King James Bible, by the way, is named after him. James's son was Charles I, and Charles had some of the tendencies of Richelieu and Louis XIV, whose aunt he married. He didn't like competing authorities. He tried to govern and raise taxes without parliament, to unify and control the church. He wanted, in other words, to be an absolute king. But unlike Louis XIV, he failed. Religious troubles in Scotland, colonial problems in Ireland, political and religious complications in England all raised a hornet's nest about Charles's ears. Parliament wouldn't vote to pay taxes to support his armed forces because if the king's military power was too great, he could force Parliament to vote the way he wanted. He could force Parliament to pay the taxes even if it hadn't voted for them. In 1642, Charles attempted to arrest 5 leaders of the House of Commons and then declared war on Parliament. Thus began the English Civil War, the major battles of which are depicted in this 18th century print. The war lasted for 7 years, and it saw the annihilation of the royal army and Charles's surrender. After continuing to intrigue against Parliament even after his defeat, Charles was tried and executed in 1649. The brief Republican interlude that followed under Oliver Cromwell didn't work out too well. When Parliament entertained a motion to disband Cromwell's army, an army that had grown very powerful after its conquest of Scotland and Ireland, Cromwell retaliated by disbanding Parliament, and he ruled thereafter as Lord Protector. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Stuarts were restored under Charles II. Until, that is, another revolution by Parliament, the Glorious Revolution, so called because it was almost bloodless. It swept out Charles's successor, James II, in 1688, and it placed on the throne a Dutchman, the Prince of Orange, whom history knows as William III. This is a contemporary Dutch print showing William arriving in England. So, by the end of the 17th century, the absolute power of the crown had been broken and the contest for supremacy had ended in a sort of partnership between Parliament and the King, competitive to begin with and fraught with tension, but settling down eventually to a parliamentary monarchy. Each of England's two revolutions was also going to inspire a great work of political thought. In 1651, 2 years after the execution of Charles I, Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan. And John Locke published his treatise on civil government in 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution. Hobbes's book, Leviathan, which incidentally he wrote while in exile in Paris, Leviathan took the current theories about nature and human nature and turned them on their head. Mankind, said Hobbes, is naturally wicked. Man is not a social being, he's a purely selfish creature, always seeking his own advantage. There are no higher aims. There is no good except pleasure. There is no evil except pain. There is no freedom beside the freedom to follow your passions. The basic principle of life is selfishness, said Hobbes. And with everybody struggling to get what they want, the natural state of man is what Hobbes calls a state of war, a constant struggle of man against man. And in this unregenerate state of nature, people live in continual fear, and their lives, said Hobbes in a famous phrase, are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So if we don't want the human race to kill itself off, we have to introduce an artificial remedy, which is power. Instead of the basic equality of humans, we now introduce a regime of inequality, the only thing that can save them from the destruction and discomfort that free men inflict on each other. In other words, we set up a political society under the authority of a monarch who necessarily has to be absolute. It's no use talking about social contracts, said Hobbes, because men won't keep any contract. The only thing that can repress their savage instincts is force and the fear that force inspires. So the absolute king must have the power of arms and also the power to settle disputes which we call justice. And since you cannot reconcile liberty and life, because the pursuit of liberty leads to anarchy and loss of life, it's better to choose life, because without life, liberty isn't much use. And however arbitrary and unpleasant this may be, it's still better than the savage freedom of catch as catch can from which it preserves us. So, Hobbes' state is in fact a leviathan, an enormous, monstrous machine which takes the place of natural society. Now you have to understand that Hobbes defended absolute power not because of some divine right, but in the name of the interest of ordinary people who needed security and peace in order to live and enjoy life. So he wasn't interested in the majesty of power, but in its utility. His absolute ruler had to deliver. He was judged by his success in providing not justice or virtue, but peace and prosperity, which is pretty much how many of us judge our own rulers, whether we admit it or not. Still, Hobbes has always shocked respectable people. Fortunately, respectable people were going to get a philosopher after their own heart in John Locke. Locke, who sailed to England with William of Orange, had just produced a theory that could be used to justify England's removal of its previous king, James II, king by the grace of God. He had set out to prove the right of a subject to rebel against his sovereign. Locke, too, started out from the state of nature, but he disagreed with Hobbes. The state of nature is simply imperfect, said Locke. To remedy its imperfections, men get together and they agree on a social contract. This contract is concluded among men for their own advantage, and it implies playing the game of social living by definitely established rules. If anybody breaks these rules, he's outlawed. And if it is the ruler who breaks the rules, then any member of society, and of course society as a whole, has the right to appeal to the rules which had been agreed on, and if necessary has the right to appeal to them by force. And Locke's conclusion was simple. If the executive power does not act according to the ends for which it has been set up, if it infringes on the liberties of the people, then this power must be removed from the hands of whoever holds it. And in fact, if the people have reason to suspect that the would-be tyrant is preparing the means to enslave them, they have the right, by natural law, to take preventive action and by open rebellion to keep him from carrying out his plans. So John Locke had not only justified the Glorious Revolution, he had also produced the concept of a natural man, on the whole decent enough and civilized enough to come to terms with himself and behaving according to natural law. This idea of natural law and Locke's conception of man as naturally decent came to form the essence and the base of the new English legal and constitutional thought. Natural law also entered into the politics of its time, and particularly into the politics of England, whose success would influence the rest of the world from then on. Moreover, it marked an alliance with Protestantism, influencing it so much that gradually and increasingly the conception of man's fall from grace was abandoned in favor of a new idea of perfectibility, man's perfectibility and society's perfectibility by man. Above all, natural law meant that men could now see that divine right, as soon as it pretended to establish the absolute rule of a man, as shown here, or a regime, divine right was not supernatural, it was anti-natural, and as such to be scorned and attacked. Now this, of course, was only the beginning. The development and the diffusion of all these ideas has gone on to our own day, but the 17th century marked a decisive stage because the theory of natural right, the theory of the rights of man, and finally the reality of hard facts had at last been joined together in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and in the ideas and in the institutions arising out of it. Locke was less vigorous than Grotius, he was more superficial than Hobbes, but he was the right man at the right time. He was responsible for the secularization of political theory and of legal theory. He was responsible for the divorce between reason and mystery, and for the relegation of divine intervention to where it belonged, in heaven, far removed from the realities of worldly affairs. And we might fairly take this passage from Locke's essay on civil government as marking both his purpose and his significance to us. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. The following century was going to write the concrete epilogue of these words. They tried to run their states rationally, efficiently, profitably. They encouraged trade, developed bureaucracy, and were the patrons of great philosophers. And they spent much of their time at war, fighting one another. The enlightened despots, this time on the Western tradition. Throughout history, you can find the correspondence between political power and economic prosperity. As a rule, at least in relation to their size, the most economically advanced countries tend to be maritime powers. In the ancient world, this was true of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, and in the 17th century, in the 18th century, it would be true about the Dutch, the English, and the French. Now, this is especially understandable when you consider what travel was like in the pre-modern world, difficult and slow. Water was by far the best highway. Now, let me give you an example that's only 300 years old. In 1698, the estates, that is the Parliament of Burgundy, voted money to buy a large bronze statue of Louis XIV. And the statue was cast in Paris, then it was brought by river to Auxerre, and from there it set off to Dijon, the capital of Burgundy, to Dijon by land, about 100 miles away. But it got stuck in the mud, and it had to be kept in a shed for 21 years until the road was good enough to bear it. Given that land transport was in such a parlous state, and bear in mind that France probably had the best roads in Europe, water transport was much better. Rivers were useful, but rivers had problems. They had rapids, they had sandbanks and shallows, and the water level went up and down, and they also had tolls, which could make even a short journey expensive. The sea, however, was a river without rapids or shallows or tolls, and ships could travel far and fast on it, carrying more cargo and more people than any river barge could. The Italian city-states in the Renaissance, Spain and Portugal in the 16th century, Holland, Britain, France in the 17th, all demonstrated that easy access to water meant trade, which meant prosperity, which meant power. And to lose access meant strangulation. In 1571, the loss of Cyprus to the Turks sealed the decline of Venice. In 1588, the English defeat of the Spanish Armada began the naval decline of Spain. And half a century after that, English fleets began to defeat the Dutch, who had previously ruled the high seas, and that was the beginning of English ascendancy. So it's a good idea to keep your eye on what happens at sea. Now, the connection between wealth and naval power, between overseas trade and prosperity, had also struck the rulers of countries in East and Central Europe that didn't have access to the ocean. One can describe much of their activity in the 17th and especially in the 18th century as a struggle to get to the sea and on it and across it. Russia drove towards the Black Sea and the Baltic. Prussia, which had Baltic ports, tried to start trading companies to sail the high seas. And the Austrians tried to revive Antwerp, although they didn't succeed because the Dutch wouldn't let them. Instead, they created a new port at the top of the Adriatic, Trieste, which would remain Austria's chief naval base into the 20th century. None of these enterprises was very successful, however, because continental powers had to concentrate on fighting various wars in Europe. So even though wealth and power depended on naval activity, security and greed still focused on land warfare. And yet the new pragmatic business mentality was gaining ground even on land, serving to moderate the enormous destructiveness of land warfare. Devastation, after all, is bad for business. And this attitude was something new. For thousands of years, warfare was more than just battles. It was the devastation of enemy land. When two Greek cities went to war, the first thing they did was to ravage the fields and orchards of the opponent. When Louis XIV fought the Habsburgs 2,300 years later, his troops burnt and ravaged the Rhineland so badly that they were still remembered in the 20th century. The pretty town of Heidelberg in the Neckar Valley was almost completely destroyed by the French in 1689 and again in 1693. What you see in Heidelberg today has almost all been built in the 18th century, except for the castle whose ruins still stand on the hill above the town. But in the 18th century, rulers and their generals started to try to keep war away from civilians. War became an exercise for soldiers, campaigns were decided by set-piece battles, and even more by sophisticated maneuvers. Who could outflank whom? Who could get the best positions? Armies which had always lived off the land also began to operate as self-contained units with their own supply trains and stores and field kitchens. This development was in part a revulsion against the bloodshed and destruction of 17th century warfare. But it was also part of a more rational approach to war. War was coming to be regarded as being more about gain than about destruction. If you approach war as logically as you approach business, you keep destruction to a minimum, you minimize incidental losses, and you don't destroy civilians or civilian property, civilian productivity, because famine and ruins are bad for the economy, and you don't want to destroy wealth, just win it. Nevertheless, like every other century, the 18th century had its wars, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where states were still establishing firm borders at each other's expense. This is when the great realm of Russia became a European power, under the rule of Peter the Great, and later under the rule of Catherine the Great. This is when a poor marginal state in North Germany turned into the Kingdom of Prussia. It forged ahead under the guidance of Frederick William I, who thought the best investment was an army, and under his son Frederick the Great, a brilliant general who cashed the dividends on his father's investment. And this is also when the Austrian Habsburgs rolled back the Turks and affirmed their hold on Central and Southeast Europe under the guidance of a remarkable woman, Maria Theresa, the Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and later under her son Joseph II. The wars in Central and Eastern Europe that made all this possible were important because they set the shape of the region for 150 years. And they affected everybody else, the English, the French, the Swedes, the Dutch, because when one power became too strong, the others would intervene against it, which was the beginning of the system of a balance of power. The Poles were especially affected by these wars because Russia and Prussia and Austria tended to settle their differences at the expense of their large divided kingdom. By 1795, Poland was carved up among the three powers. But if you take your eyes off the map of Europe, you will find that the 18th century wars were not really about Europe, but about world dominion and world trade. The French, English, Spanish, Dutch were really fighting about who was going to get the Spanish trade and Spanish possessions in the Americas, about what was going to happen to French possessions in America and India, and about the fate of British colonies in North America. And so the scale of European politics had exploded, and wars were no longer primarily about family politics, they were about trade and profit. But the continental rulers in Central and Eastern Europe and other rulers who didn't have competitive navies could not participate in these great oceanic contests, and so instead they tried to make their realms more efficient, more rational, more productive. They tried to generate by internal reform what they couldn't get from overseas trade. And this was the origin of what we describe as enlightened despotism. Would-be enlightened despots were to be found in Naples and Tuscany, Spain and Portugal, Prussia and Austria, Russia, Scandinavia, all trying to run their states rationally, efficiently and profitably. The typical enlightened autocrat was Frederick II, King of Prussia from 1740 to 1786. Frederick was a patron of Voltaire. He liked to describe himself as the first servant of his people. He wrote several books explaining that statesmanship should be founded on virtue and justice and responsibility. And he spent much of his reign breaking his word, making war, enlarging the territories he had inherited. Men like Frederick were supposed to be enlightened because they tried to go about their business more rationally than their predecessors. They were interested in revenue. They knew that revenue was higher when production and exchange were more intense. And since they couldn't get to the sea and exploit it, they tried to develop the economy in other ways. They rationalized government administration. They introduced a census of the population, which could be used for taxing citizens and to draft men into the army. They surveyed lands to know just what properties were worth. They named streets and numbered the houses in order to make identification and accounting easier. And they developed the bureaucracy and trained bureaucrats to work more efficiently. The spirit of the new bureaucrats was completely secular. They had no preconceptions, and they would try anything provided it worked. Everybody and everything was grist to their mill and grist to their will. And one result of this attitude was that just as in the older trading cities, bureaucrats were not interested in religious conformity. Religion was simply one factor in their political calculations. Rulers might well be practicing Christians, but politically they would tolerate any kind of worship that didn't trouble the public order and that contributed to public wealth. One result of this was that the 18th century turns out to be a great age of prosperous refugees settling in other, more pragmatic countries. Catholics from Ireland fleeing English rule, supporters of the exiled Stuarts getting out of Scotland, and Huguenots leaving France after Louis XIV abolished the Edict of Nantes and began a new wave of persecutions. The Huguenot emigration was going to give England the actor David Garrick in the 18th century, Cardinal Newman in the 19th century, and in the 20th, Winston Churchill, whose mother's family had emigrated to America from France. The Irish filled Europe with soldiers of fortune, and they were going to provide France with two presidents, General Macmahon in the 19th century and General de Gaulle in the 20th. Even the great Duke of Wellington had an Irish grandfather, although Wellington himself always denied he was Irish. A man, he said, is not a horse because he was born in a stable. But the bureaucracy went beyond religious tolerance. The same practical reasons that made the state relatively tolerant, or really indifferent to religious issues, this also suggested that the state attack the church insofar as the church might aspire to operate as an independent entity. The state, after all, had to dominate and control everything in its ken. It attacked the church in order to get the church's money or its property and to put them to more productive uses. It put pressure on the church to carry out the church's social obligations, to operate as an effective machine for charity or as an effective representative of the central government. And it attacked the church in order to abolish or to limit ecclesiastical censorship and to improve education. The new states were interested in the church insofar as it could contribute to their plans. Joseph II of Austria, for example, regarded parish priests as salaried state officials whose duty it was to cooperate with police in the service of the state. So in their quest for education, efficiency, rationalism, these new bureaucratic states relied on anybody who would help them, skilled professionals, teachers, writers, and scientists, mostly from Western Europe. And it was to impress and attract this educated and highly influential minority that some of the Central and East European princes removed censorship and introduced a certain freedom of the press in their dominions. They wanted to impress the Westerners, and they also wanted to copy them because Western practices and ideas, especially English and French ideas, were connected with other Western superiorities in technology, weaponry, productivity. What Frederick of Prussia and Joseph of Austria wanted most was a well-ordered state, a population that was prosperous, educated, satisfied because it lived under efficient government and under wise laws that were consistently administered by royal justice, not capriciously by nobles on their estates. They wanted cities growing with industry, fattened by production and profit, and above all, they wanted regular taxes, efficiently collected from everybody, coming in regularly, reliably, to pay for the state machinery and for a large, well-trained, well-equipped army. But that was exactly what they didn't have. And to get it would require a social revolution to change things from what they actually were to what they should be, and to change them quickly, because they didn't have time to sit around and wait. But you also have to bear in mind that the last thing they wanted was a real social revolution. Frederick and Joseph and the others wanted the social hierarchy to go on just as before. They wanted the nobles muzzled and tamed, but they did not want to turn society upside down. They wanted it to function efficiently, for their benefit, for the benefit of the state and of its absolute ruler, and that was it. But in Prussia and Hungary, the nobles wouldn't stand for reforms. In Belgium, the middle class objected and rioted. In other countries, the middle class was too weak to help and hence useless. In the Catholic countries and in Russia, the local church protested. In Transylvania and Bohemia, the peasants revolted. And elsewhere, they either couldn't help, or when they tried, they weren't wanted. At an impasse, the reforming princes found their main allies in a group of men whom you would not at first expect to support them, the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Men like Diderot, Voltaire, Hume, Bentham, and Kant. At the end of the 17th century, the first dictionary of the French Academy defined the philosophe, the philosopher, as a student of the sciences, a wise man who lives a quiet life, and or a man who by free thought puts himself above the ordinary duties and obligations of civil life. You must not think of the philosophe as what we today call philosophers, professional hair-splitters, logicians, semanticists. The 18th century philosopher was what we might today describe as a sociologist, in the sense that he studied society with an eye on the possibilities of social reform. Above all, he or she was a free thinker, at least in the sense that they were hostile to the commonly accepted version of revealed religion, and that's how you might best think of the philosophers, as free thinkers and social critics. In their own minds, however, the philosophers were above all rationalists, people who, as Immanuel Kant put it, dared to know. People who were determined to imbue the world with a consciousness of the rights and the powers of human intelligence. Their point of view had been shaped by the science of Isaac Newton, who taught that all nature is founded in universal law and that its regularities can be understood and mastered by the human mind. And it was shaped by the psychology of John Locke, who taught that the faculty of reasoning seldom or never deceives those who trust in it, and that men are reasonable beings, capable of using their own knowledge and intelligence for the promotion of their own happiness. All this being so, the philosophers believe that if you want to make men happy and perfect, all you have to do is enlighten them. And their ideas of enlightenment came curiously close to those of the reforming princes. The philosophes, like the princes, wanted order, prosperity, tolerance, education, and justice fairly administered. They thought the church was one of the main obstacles to all this. They thought that the middle class as a source of prosperity and enlightenment should be encouraged and its interests favored. They thought that aristocratic privilege was unjustified by reason and ought to be ended, so that advancement should be open to talent and capacity, and taxes should be paid by all. They knew exactly what reforms were necessary to bring about the good society, and they had talked about it, they had written about it for years to persuade their fellow citizens, and it hadn't done a bit of good. So what they wanted now were philosopher kings, enlightened despots. And they saw them not in the West, where established society was impossible to move, but in Central and Eastern and Southern Europe, where new lands were ready to be molded into perfection. Also they thought. We shall see just how enlightened these enlightened despots were in our next program. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.